I want to thank everybody from our community for joining us for today's webinar. I especially want to thank the members of the Gates Foundation team, Matt, Miller, and Bryan, for spending their time today introducing Mojaloop to the community. So as we stated in the emails, I believe this software complements the stack we're providing very well. And I hope after today's meeting, we can have members of our community and ecosystem join the Mojaloop community and find use cases where they need to implement it. And hopefully we can share and impart lessons we've learned building out our ecosystem with the Mojaloop community as well. So I'll pass it on over to, I think Miller is going to be presenting first, but thank everybody for joining. And so we'll hold questions and answers till the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. And then towards the end of the session, we'll also unmute everybody else to ask and answer their questions. So, okay, thanks guys.
Well, good morning, everyone. Miller Abel here. We're going to talk through today the project that we've had underway for the last couple of years to, as it says on the title, create interoperable payment platforms in service of the poor. This is an outgrowth of what we've called at the Gates Foundation the Level 1 project, which is our attempt to start from first principles and to look at what are the essential elements that an interoperable payment system in a country that is in service of the poor would have to have. And those principles that we've developed over that time essentially converged on a very small set of functionality that was required. And we didn't find that functionality being readily deployed in the markets. So we undertook to create a manifestation of those principles. And the result of that is the open source software shared service solution that we're going to talk about today. We've nicknamed this Mojaloop, which is a play on the Swahili word for one. And it essentially means that we believe that rather than having multiple systems that are all closed loop, sort of the winner take all paradigm that's been prevalent in Africa for a long time, rather than promoting that further, we want to see those all connected together in a common open loop solution, one that we might see in the banking world as natural and obvious, but that has so far been eluded in the mobile money world. So without much further ado, let's get into this a little bit. So one of the things that we had to do first is we had to recognize who the customer really was and meet them where they were. And in the focus countries that we have, we've found that the mobile phone is the tool. And so it has to be that as they use mobile phones now, and they're using them in a 2G world rather than in a 3G or a 4G world, that is, they don't really have smartphones as much as they have the simple basic phones, and that there is a need to access common services during the day. The phone is the natural and obvious tool for that. Being able to operate, though, some of these advanced systems that we use in the developed world on a simple phone is problematic. And so we've had to decompose what was required of the interoperable elements of the service to those that can actually be consumed by a 2G simple basic phone. One thing that we did not do is to undertake to build an open source wallet platform. There are wallet platforms out there now. Some of them are thriving, and we don't see a need in the market to introduce that. What we do see is a need to connect those existing platforms together. And as we get into this discussion today, we're going to talk about some of the work that we've done specifically to assist those platforms in making their systems ready as well. But primarily, we want to focus today on the Mojaloop bit. So what is it? Well, fundamentally, it's this. It's an open source software for creating interoperable payment platforms that connect all digital financial providers and customers. And what we mean by that is it's not a single discipline solution that only works with mobile phone driven payment systems. It can also work with banks It can work with MFIs. We believe, as we'll discuss later, that it's consistent with a Mifos environment, and that we see that group of these different approaches to financial services all needing to be connected together so that there's a seamless interoperability between them. The affluent community that has bank accounts, credit cards, and access to finance still need to interact with the middle of the economy and the bottom of the economy as they consume services and exchange and provide services. And so connecting banks, mobile money operators, and microfinance systems together is a natural and obvious beginning point for us. To make this a little bit clearer, let's see if we can't run this video.
Imagine your life without banking. How would you pay your bills or store your money for safekeeping? For 2 billion people around the world, these challenges are very real. They buy food, share money with friends and family, and make dozens of other transactions every day, but they do it all in cash. As a result, they miss out on the security and other benefits of bank accounts and payment cards, while financial...
It might just be me, but the volume is extremely low on the actual video.
When cash becomes digital, this all changes. People can spend and save money more easily and securely, and financial providers can access billions of new customers. Digital financial services are starting to spread around the world, but not nearly as fast as they could. One big reason is that providers have to build everything on their own. That means they have to charge high transaction fees that are hard for poor customers to afford, or they don't build anything for new markets at all. It also means that most services end up being a closed...
The volume got a bit better, but the video's now in the background.
Grace, for example, can use her mobile money account to pay her energy bill and buy groceries, but to receive her paycheck, pay her daughter's school fees, and send money to her parents back home, she still has to use cash. Because her employer uses one bank, the school uses another one, and her parents use a mobile money service that is different from the one Grace uses. If companies had a common platform to work from, they wouldn't have to worry about high costs and closed loops.
Are you linked in over computer audio or phone audio?
Mojaloop is open source code for making digital payments secure and interoperable across an entire country or region. Named after the Swahili word for one,
Miller, can you bring the video back to the screen?
providers and customers together
Yeah.
one inclusive system.
My apologies.
So, when Grace receives her paycheck and sends money to her parents and her daughter's school, she can do it all digitally with a single account. Because behind the scenes, technology powered by Mojaloop is powering everyone's
There you go.
services. There are three main components to the code. An interoperability layer, which facilitates payments between different kinds of services, including bank accounts, mobile money wallets, and merchant accounts. A directory service layer, which routes each payment to the correct provider in the ecosystem, and a transaction settlement layer, which makes sure that all the money that changes hands between customers throughout the day is recorded in each provider's master ledger as well. Developers can use parts of the software to build or adapt financial products and services, or they can take the whole thing and build an internet of payments, routing transactions from anyone to anyone, instantly and securely. Mojaloop is open source so that anyone can use it and make it better. It's software for banks, fintech firms, systems architects, mobile operators, and tech companies. In a world where financial services have always left some people out of the loop, Mojaloop is a tool to bring us all together, because an economy that includes everyone benefits everyone.
So I don't know how well that video actually played. There is a possibility you can go to mojaloop.io and the video is available there if you want to replay that. So why did we build this? So when we began looking at the different focus countries for our work, And we discovered that there was some attempts at interoperability that had been done in the past, some of which we funded, to create these bilateral connections between systems. They were not really achieving the goals that we had set out for the level 1 project. And in addition to being complex, they're limited mathematically to really just a few participants. Once you get to a certain level, it becomes too complex to maintain. But there's another limit as well that we wanted to get past, and that is once the connections are made bilaterally between providers, they tend to form a grid that a penetrating fence in essence that no new provider can really join because it's too expensive to do so. And the reason for that is that in the bilateral arrangements, each of the providers has to buy property on the other systems. That is, it's a pre-funded model. And so they have to make a cash deposit on each of their other systems in exchange for e-money. And then when they're making payments across those systems, they have to do so by trading in their own account on those systems and then periodically rebalance them. So if you have 3 really large providers in the market already, they might have $150,000 US on deposit with each of their competitors. And a new competitor comes along and wants to join, and the conversation goes something like, would you allow me to join your bilateral system? And by the way, would each of you put $150,000 US deposit on my system? I know I'm really small and I only have 5,000 customers, but I'd really like to join. And it doesn't go very well. Obviously, that's not a viable strategy for market management. So we need a central system that is a place where an individual provider can connect directly, and that the onboarding to that central system can then be managed directly, and the cost of doing so can be reduced. In addition, we want to see central settlement occur so that we don't have this pre-funded strategy where we have to cause the participants to place deposits on each other's systems. There's also risk associated with the failure of one of these companies if they were small that we wouldn't want to expose the rest of the system to. And so by putting some of the functions at the center, we can meet some of those goals. So fundamentally, we're looking at a system. This is an ecosystem view. And what we have here is we're showing at the center this stack of services, which we call the digital financial services scheme. And surrounding that are a set of, in this diagram, 4 digital financial service providers, 2 of which are labeled A and B in the diagram. And each of those providers are going to source their platform from someone. But the platforms themselves might be completely different, written differently, and provided by different companies. But they're going to connect those systems together, knowing that each of the systems will provide pretty much the same set of things. They're going to have an e-money ledger, some kind of consumer account management. They're going to have a way to open accounts. They're going to provide for wallet and bulk pay services. So in our diagram here, the Alpha platform and the Gamma platform are both providing roughly the same functionality, although they may be doing it in different ways and offering different sets of experiences to their customers. But they're going to then connect to this set of financial services in the center through a scheme arrangement. And the system at the center will offer a set of services, which are those we have listed here. At the minimum, there's an interoperability service for transfers. That's responsible for clearing and settling payments. There is a directory service, which is responsible for resolving the identifier of a payee, somebody that you want to pay, to the provider who services that account. So the directory service itself here, as we talk about a little bit later, is responsible for that resolution. It doesn't actually hold a directory of everyone in the system. All it has to maintain is a relationship between a payment identifier, such as a phone number, a national ID, or a merchant ID, or something like this. It has to resolve that to the financial service provider responsible for that account. We believe also that there's a shared fraud and risk management service that allows the system to perform some checks at the center while other checks are still performed at the edges. And then finally, there's a multilateral net settlement system that assembles from the cleared transactions and maintains the net positions between the providers. And then periodically throughout the trading day, it issues instructions to a common settlement agent or a settlement bank to actually move money between the provider platforms. So the central services themselves, broken up this way, if we went through this in the order in which they would be consumed, each of the things that a financial provider cannot really easily do for itself, we want to push to the center, at least the parts of it that need to be at the center. So account lookup, when Alice wants to pay Bob, Bob says, here's my phone number. I want you to send 1,000 shillings to my phone. Alice will go to her financial provider menus and request that payment. The account has to be looked up somehow. And so since we don't know who the financial provider for Bob is, Alice's financial provider goes to the central directory with Bob's phone number and says, who services Bob's account? And the answer comes back, well, it's Bob's DFSP. Then some fraud checks can be conducted to see whether or not Bob is in the designated entity list or whether he's been blacklisted. And once that is basically passed, then we're going to go and set up a transfer. So the transfer itself then fundamentally is what the central services are there to accommodate. And we'll get into a little bit here as to how that works. But first, the central directory service, I want to reiterate, is essentially a front end to a question and answer. The question is, who provides the service, the financial services for this ID? And the IDs might be a variety of different types. It could be an MSISDN, it could be a national ID, it could be a merchant ID. And then in each of those cases, we want to know who the DFSP is that services that can receive payments on behalf of that ID. But the central directory itself doesn't have a database of participants. It simply links to these back-end oracles in each of these cases. For the purposes of resolving a mobile phone number, we use the mobile number portability database. And at present, we have onboarded the GSMA's Pathfinder system. Pathfinder is the global resource that the GSMA members use to resolve the provider for phone numbers for the purposes of telecom. But it's based on the DNS service. And so we were able to augment that and put additional records into the DNS that are associated to a mobile phone number that identify the scheme ID of the participant in the mobile payment scheme. So again, the details are not actually held in the registry. If we get into a national ID environment like India with Aadhaar, the bank verification number that's maintained by NIBS in Nigeria or NADRA in Pakistan, then we'll find that there is an opportunity there to perhaps address payments to a national ID. This becomes super important when we start talking about benefits payments in bulk, where we want to be able to address them to the national ID for a person where their phone numbers may change, or in a system where the phone numbers are biometrically identified, such as in Pakistan, we could choose to address those benefits payments to their mobile phone number directly. But you'd want that ability to decide when you deploy in an environment which of those ID systems is most meaningful. And finally, there would be a merchant registry where, as you become a merchant, you acquire a persistent ID for yourself, regardless of who it is that provides you that service. And then you have flexibility to move between acquiring providers. The shared fraud detection and risk management service is not intended to remove the responsibility of the financial providers to perform their own fraud checks and maintain their own systems. What it's intended to do is recognize that if you can see both sides of the transaction, you can make better decisions about fraud. And so the central fraud sharing service is intended to, over time, grow a set of capabilities that can be relied upon by the financial providers to meet their obligations to the regulator in a more consistent way, in a more accurate way. We haven't done much here yet. What we've done for now is to suggest the idea of this by putting in a scoring system that provides a score between 0 and 100. 0 means you're blacklisted, 100 means you're whitelisted for some reason why you're always going to be able to transact. And some number between 0 and 100 would be a score that indicated you were somewhere less than perfect, but better than blacklisted. And it would be up to the financial providers to set their own thresholds for that. And of course, the scheme would have to define how that score was calculated. The intention, though, going forward is not that the central service actually operates that, but that it is, again, a front end to a service that can be developed and managed by either a commercial entity or a national provider that it can do a much clearer job of central financial risk management than could be perhaps done solely by the end providers. Then the central ledger, and we want to spend some time talking about this. What we've done here is to put together a set of transfer services that are set up to facilitate the funds clearing, but based on real-time messaging. So the thing that's different about this system than, for instance, an automated clearinghouse system is that we want the customers to experience payments that clear in real time, that are irrevocable, and that clear at par, and that settle at cost by the end of the value day. So for that set of things to be true, a number of other things have to be true. The cost of doing a transfer has to be very, very small. In fact, so low that you probably don't have to charge a per transaction fee to recover costs. That allows you to clear at par. That is not charging the customer for actually sending money through the central ledger. There may be other retail fees associated with certain transaction types, but it shouldn't be because it's expensive to do an interoperation through the center. That it's real time suggests that the providers themselves can reach a final arrangement between them on the retail transaction while the customers are standing there. So this can be facilitated as it would be with a card payment in the US or in the UK. That the transactions are push payments is fundamental to lowering the costs. That is, unlike an ACH system where you present a demand to pay, you give that demand draft to the merchant, and the merchant deposits that, a check or a demand, an electronic draft, into their account, and their account provider goes to your account provider and requests the money be pulled from your account. That's really a non-starter in developing markets. Push payments are the mode that feels the most like cash. And so as what we're trying to do is get people to convert from cash to digital, that is to digitize cash, we don't really want to bring in a system that is really intended to digitize checks, which is what an ACH is, and it's what a credit card is. So in our world, we see push payments as the key to unlocking a set of low-cost facilities that would be very difficult to do in the if we didn't have push payments. So the central ledger is responsible for facilitating clearing. It will maintain deferred multilateral net positions between the providers. That is, providers A, B, and C will each owe each other different amounts, will either be net payers or net receivers. The central ledger will maintain those positions in real time. And periodically, it will submit settlement instructions to a common settlement bank to allow the net payers to pay into the system and the net receivers to be paid. And it will calculate and settle scheme level off transaction fees. These are, we call them off transaction fees because they aren't actually within the transaction flow itself, but are perhaps dependent upon the volume of transactions or the net amount that's transacted. So we might say that there was a cost to the system. The scheme charges the participants is based on the number of transactions that they post or the total value of those transactions. A tiered-based fee structure might then be calculated. So looking at clearing for a moment, this is set up so that we can clear the interprovider transactions in gross and calculate the off-transaction fees. It facilitates only credit push transactions, and it handles this in real time. And by that we mean that a transaction flowing through the center can be cleared in something on the order of 100 milliseconds. the entire transaction experienced by the customer, with including the user interfaces and the transaction setup parts, might extend the transaction time to something on the order of 2 to 5 seconds. But that our intention is that this be experienced as a real-time payment system. So notifications are sent to respective parties from the central ledger in order to keep things flowing and in balance. And there's a transaction history that's also maintained at the center. And we'll get into each of those parts in a bit. What sets the central ledger system apart from other systems is that we utilize the interledger protocol. And this is a distributed ledger technology protocol that offers conditional payments using a cryptographically strong condition on each payment and a cryptographically strong digital receipt. It, in essence, allows messaging directly between the scheme participants and the central ledger, but it ensures that the inter-scheme and the over-the-top Internet of Payments are secured just as strongly as those that might be for the Internet of, for the financial providers themselves. And this allows for an extension of the system to a sort of Internet of Payments. This is done, though, in this very particular way. Alice's financial provider on the left will send a quotation request to the financial provider on the right saying, Alice would like to pay Bob 1,000 Tanzanian shillings. And the financial provider on the right, Bob's provider, will say, well, to do that, please post 1,100 shillings in gross, and I will make sure that Bob gets 1,000 Tanzanian shillings. That wholesale fee then of 100 shillings would then be included in that quotation message. Alice's financial provider might choose to pass that fee on in some form to Alice and say, presenting to Alice a screen that says, to make this payment, it will cost you 1,100 Tanzanian shillings. Are you okay? If so, enter your PIN. Having done that, the prepared payment will be posted to the central ledger that will then forward that prepared notification to the financial provider for Bob. The prepared payment is, in essence, a nearly complete hash of all the important details of the payment, the amount, who's going to be paid, who's doing the paying, what currency is it in. But there's one missing piece of information, and that is the digital receipt. So when the message was originally prepared, Bob's financial provider will have generated a receipt saying, if I were to have accepted this payment, this is the receipt I would generate. And it lays it down next to the other data and generates a hash of the entire set of material. It then removes the digital receipt and throws it away. So when it returns this hash of the prepared payment, the central ledger and the initiating provider, Alice's provider, have almost everything they need to verify that hash, but not everything. They can send that payment through the system. The system can accept the payment as evidence that the payer wants to clear, and it can send it to the financial provider for Bob. The digital receipt can then be regenerated, and it can be sent back to the center. The center can now take that digital receipt, and now it has all the information it needs to verify the conditional payment. It can forward that digital receipt back to Alice's DFSP, the preparing DFSP, and it can then, that DFSP can then also verify that the payment was accepted by the payee. So a very simple hash lock then provides for a conditional payment and a cryptographically strong receipt. The digital receipt itself is generated using a keyed hash of the details, whereas the conditional payment itself is simply a SHA-256. That's in essence how the interledger system works. And the reason we looked at this rather than at a common blockchain-like solution is that we found that it's very difficult to get all of the providers in a market to agree on a common ledger. But if they can operate in this way on their own ledger, in essence, we can provide them what we'll call a cryptographically strong ledger synchronization protocol. So it allows Alice's DFSP to make a mark on Alice's ledger for the benefit of Bob. That mark is then replicated on the central ledger and on Bob's DFSP's ledger. And if that is not accepted by Bob, then no mark is made anywhere. The entire transaction is rolled back. So this has the same pattern we would see in a distributed database as the multi-phase commit. So the reason we looked at Interledger, the primary reason, as I mentioned, was that getting everyone to agree on a common ledger using a blockchain solution doesn't really work. And going back to using banking messaging such as ISO 20022 or ISO 8583 is also problematic. What we wanted is to separate the business logic from the mechanics of moving money. There are so many different use cases that have been deployed in different markets and with different rules that it's problematic for every participant in the market to completely agree and understand every business message that would have to be exchanged. And that's the method that ISO 20022 uses. If you were to exchange messages with a bank and you construct a message, it has to be carefully constructed in a way that that bank will understand it. But more, it has to also be constructed in a way that correspondent banks and connectors between the banks can understand it. We wanted something simpler than that, that said the business logic is really between the end parties and their DFSPs. Once they've agreed on that between themselves, point to point, as counterparties, they want to then move the money itself in a very simple way. That is, they want to conduct a gross transfer of funds. So the minimum set of value transfer semantics can be then standardized, and it leaves you then the ability to be quite flexible on what business use cases can be layered on top of that. And that's been at the center of our design paradigm here. So after we've gone through a clearing strategy, we end up with the need to settle. So in clearing, what we've done is we've said that the obligations between the facilitating counterparties have been offset against a settlement obligation. And periodically during the day, we want to resolve those settlement obligations by having the net payers pay into the system and the net receivers be paid. To do that, then the system conducts a deferred multilateral net settlement. It does that by having calculated the positions throughout the settlement window. It can do this then using automatic straight-through processing to the settlement bank, so that it's not something where we have to have people sitting at treasury terminals talking on phones trying to decide how much money to move. This can be done automatically. It's adapted to various settlement arrangements and message formats itself. So we do not need to use Interledger for the purposes of settlement, though we could. What we're using in this case is probably ISO 20022 PAX messaging to a settlement bank. And because this is tracking net position since the previous settlement, we don't have to have access to the settlement account balances themselves. What we do need to know is what is the net debit cap? That is, what is for each provider the limit of negative balance that the system will allow them to carry and still continue trading. If they exceed that cap, then outflow trading will stop. They will stop clearing outgoing transactions, although inbound transactions would still be permitted. And if they stay within that limit, they're allowed to conduct transactions at full speed and without restraint. The other thing that's provided here is settlement reconciliation. At the end of a settlement window, all of the transactions that were cleared during that and settled during that settlement window are provided back in batch to the individual providers so that they can resolve and check off the outstanding positions that they have. Fees, I'm going to pretty much skip over. We talked about it before. There's a need perhaps to do off-transaction fees. It can look at the balances and maintain those at the center, and there can be a variety of scheme calculations for this. Another element that we've introduced is something we call forensic logging, and this is the ability to conduct a after-the-fact investigation into what was going on during the time at which a suspicious activity occurred. So we want to record all of the systemically important events, such as logging in on consoles, a system entering or leaving service, network partitions, and of course the individual transactions themselves. Every one would be entered into a secure time log. In this case, we're looking at having each of the log entries signed horizontally so that the log entry itself cannot be modified after it's entered in the log. but we're also going to take batches of 50 to 100 entries and seal them by vertical signing so that and a entry cannot be removed, a new one cannot be added. You can't change the position or order of entries in that batch. You cannot prune entries off the end or add entries to the front. So by doing so, then that batch becomes essentially hardened or sealed and can be then referred to later for forensic checks. This was done as a result and a response to the Bangladesh incident that occurred last year, where $81 million went missing over a long weekend, and they couldn't figure out what had gone on. It took them about a week to finally sort it out, and that's because in addition to using stolen credentials to move the money at the center, they opened up the log and they erased their evidence that they had been there. And the extra time that it took then by going through the log to find this, the money was gone, and so were the perpetrators. So we want to at least secure this part of it and say that what goes on at the center ought to be recorded and logged in a way that can be verified later. I'm going to pass it over to Bryan here, who can go through a quick set of demonstrations, and then we'll get to Q&A. And I think what we're going to do here is see what we can do. I know, Bryan, if you'll be able to do maybe one example using the USSD simulator, and then we can quickly get to the animated diagram.
Okay, sounds good.
Do I need to do anything to get? Looks like it's all done. Awesome.
Okay, great. So going to try to do this in about 10 minutes. What we have here is, and for Mojaloop, we have a simulated DFSP, and it's not software that you would take forward and try to make a wallet like Miller talked about earlier. It's enough to simulate the interactions that we would have with a bank, so we can, one, prove out the use cases, that we're not having to go do unnatural things to be able to supply the APIs with data, and so that we can demonstrate the system working end to end. And that's been quite valuable when we set up lab environments. We can have a simulated DFSP working as the counterparty to the organization that we're setting up the lab for. But this is a typical USSD experience. And here, Bob is going to send money to Alice. And I would choose one and here to send money, and then enter Alice's identifier, in this case, phone number. And what's happened here, and I'm going to show this visually in a moment, is we've gone out to the central directory and said, who do I talk to about this identifier, the phone number? And then it came back with a URI for the receiving DFSP. We connected over there and we said, tell me some things about this identifier so that I can validate a transaction. And what we've agreed at the scheme level is appropriate is the person's name. So now I'm able to say, yes, Alice Cooper is who I meant to send funds to. And if I now enter an amount, it's going to go out and quote. And it's both ask the receiving DFSP, if I want Alice to receive $27.50, what will the fee be? It's also queried the path that the funds are going to have to move along, which in more sophisticated cases might have included a currency conversion or a border hop, or shifts onto more expensive payment networks, because we can hook lots of payment networks together. Those fees would all be included here. And if I'm happy to send the money, I enter my PIN, and then the funds are sent. On what I've done now is I've flipped over to the other DFSP, the one that Alice is a customer of. And if Alice was to check her mini statement, she would see that she has received, or he has received, actually the $27.50 right here just came through. So that's a kind of a visual example of how a system might work, and it shows the semantics that need to happen. Now, if we
Bryan,
go,
before you proceed, I just want to make the point here again to reinforce that the Mojaloop system itself doesn't include a wallet platform. So for us to actually make any progress with it, we needed wallet platforms to work with it. And the software group provided us with a test platform. So in essence, this is the functions of a mobile wallet that would be required in order to conduct these transactions. The intention is not that we are open sourcing a wallet platform here, but we needed a scaffolding in order to test.
right. So now I'm going to demonstrate kind of what's really happening with the APIs. And what Mojaloop is the things that are at the center of this, as well as there's some code that's been provided to make integration easier. So there's scheme adapters you'll see here, and the connectors are part of the interledger protocol, and the ledger adapter is also there. And these are kind of your integration points that you could wholesale write yourselves or could reuse. And effectively, it's just got one side that is your internal API, and then on the other side, it speaks the Mojaloop APIs. So can reuse that to speed things up or not. But Mojaloop itself is the central service stack, along with the central ledger and the central directory, and possibly a central risk and fraud service when one's developed for it. So let's kind of go through the interactions. So the initial thing is we want to look up somebody by their identifier. And what happens is, in the case of Pathfinder being the back end, we make a connection to the central directory, and we ask the question, tell me who services this identifier. The central directory is simply a front end for back end systems. Pathfinder is the GSMA's solution for number portability, and we go ask it, and what we get back is the payee DFSP, and then we make a request to that system directly to ask for details about the customer. So the important part here is the customer details were never pushed to the center. We're asking in real time the receiving DFSP about their customer. They completely own the information, and the scheme is free to define what sort of information is appropriate to share here. You could share an image or a name or some biometrics. You can be as sophisticated as you want, but ultimately the person sending funds needs to validate at some level that they're sending funds to the right person who they intended to. That's what we're trying to achieve here. Once we're happy with that step, then we're going to quote the retail fees, if you will, between the two participants. And this is also the receiving DFSP's chance to validate that they want to participate in this transaction. So they might check some back-end rules and say, am I willing to allow this customer of mine to receive funds for this use case right now? They might have exceeded a daily limit, or they might be on some sort of an internal blacklist. Any number of reasons why they might say no. But if the answer is yes, then this is where we go out, and this box on the right is when that condition is generated that will later be used to validate the payment. And in the Mojaloop code base, there's two services that can do the cryptography for you. One is a Java library you can just call out to. The other is a REST service that you can run and call out to, and either one depending on your technology stack. And it's going to create the interledger packet and do all of the dirty work for you. Later, you can also use it to validate the condition and the packet, and to unpack data out of it if you need to get into the data. So you don't have to understand interledger per se to use that. The next step in quotation is quoting the actual route. And this could be a long chain of hops, and it can include currency conversion. So there's fees. So you think about the first thing is this part is, UPS delivers the package. So what's their fees to actually get what you had previously agreed to put in the box from point A to point B? And then all of that is returned and showed to the customer. And if they decide to proceed with the transaction, if they decide not to, nothing is on hold at this point. Nothing's been committed. Nobody has had to stick anything in a database anywhere. It can just go away. But if they decide to actually proceed with the transaction, then we're going to prepare a payment. And let me back this up here. There we go. Okay. So what we're effectively going to do is first put funds on hold on the sending side. And depending on the kind of institution you are, you might physically put funds on hold, or you might not. I certainly have some interesting conversations with banks where they don't do that sort of thing. Mobile wallet providers absolutely do. But in principle, you're saying I'm able to guarantee that I can fulfill my end of this transaction, and then the sending system notifies the center to please forward this payment along. The center makes a mark, which is going to be a mark between the two financial institutions, and then forwards that along to the receiving institution that evaluates the condition that it previously generated when it created this condition. Right. And if it's happy to proceed with the transaction, and it can, at this point, it can also check internal rules and make sure that nothing's changed. The customer is still able to accept this money and not on a blacklist. Then it notifies the center that it would like to receive its funds. So please fulfill me. So now there's a committed transaction. They're gonna receive money, and then the center notifies the both systems that the payment has been committed. So that's the interaction that's happening at each of the steps. And with that, I think we can turn it over to questions and answers, and happy to get into more detail about any of these steps as well.
Okay,
great.
thank
Well,
you, Bryan and,
yeah, please.
and Miller. Yeah, so Miller, I think you can see the questions that have come through so far, so maybe you want to start going through them chronologically from when they first came in. So
what I'm not necessarily seeing the questions other than things that were related to the audio quality. So
okay, yeah, well, the first question, Siva had one. So he asked about why central services, can we have decentralized distributed services? And I think you addressed some of that later on, but if you want to speak to that.
yeah, let me just reiterate briefly that our belief is that the central services are a more efficient way of dealing with interoperability than the bilateral arrangements that had been used already. For example, in Tanzania and some of the West African countries that have tried it. And the primary reasons for that are that in money movement, in a bilateral arrangement, it typically relies on pre-funding, and pre-funding is a very expensive from a liquidity point of view. And secondly, it turns out that once you've got those arrangements in place between 2 or 3 providers, you might have 50 providers in a market that really need to be connected. It's mathematically inconceivable that you would have 50 of them connected bilaterally. There has to be some way of concentrating that traffic. And there has to be a way to become more liquidity efficient. So that's primarily why we address this. There may in fact be distributed models that could work as well. Blockchain is one that's being tried within the crypto community, but it's not by itself probably completely sufficient for what we're looking at. I'm not sure if I completely answered the question there, but.
Yeah, I think that was a good.
It's maybe worth also mentioning, and it's good to clarify that there is not a blockchain at the center of this. It's something that commonly gets confused. Interledger does provide some of the benefits that you would get from the guarantee that funds got where they were supposed to, or they don't go anywhere. The other bit is kind of centralized regulatory oversight, which when you look at countries wanting to take this live, a strong driving factor in that is that's what they want to achieve. They want better visibility of money movement, and that is easy to provide in this sort of a setup. So getting every institution in a country to agree to do something on their own is quite hard. Getting a country to do it because it's good for its own benefit, and then having that flow down to all of the institutions is potentially a much easier path to ultimately benefit a network.
Yeah, and I think that point relates nicely to Megan's question that came up. And she asked, can you clarify who the owner operator of the central ledger is?
Sure, and I think our view there is that the central system is operated by a purpose-built and operated utility that would be operated on what we call a not-for-loss basis. That is, a profit is not prohibited, but that's not the purpose of the institution. The purpose of the institution is to run at the lowest possible cost an interoperable service for the benefit of the direct participants, and that notionally it could be run by the central bank itself. We're investigating that in several markets, but it could also be run by a commercial consortium, and that commercial consortium would have the same goals to reduce costs at the center as would a government in that role. While there could be a view that it could be run as a profit-making institution, we think that's counter to the level 1 principles of low-cost service. And so we wouldn't support that, though it could certainly be done that way as well, in a case where that was meaningful, say, outside of our mission. There's a question from Siva here about how Ripple is related to Mojaloop, and I should talk about that briefly. Ripple Labs was the developer of the Interledger protocol. They're continuing to develop that, and they're very close to creating a separate foundation called the Interledger Foundation to manage the development of those specifications. The key piece here is that Interledger itself and the component, the specifications are open source and they're open standards. The components that have been developed to implement the cryptography and other parts of Interledger are open source, and they're fully available from the other foundations. So for instance, the JS Foundation holds the JavaScript components for the Interledger, and I believe it's the Hyperledger Foundation has taken on the Java versions of those components. The Interledger Foundation, though, will be the one that maintains and carries on the work on the specifications. So Ripple itself and the Ripple network doesn't itself have any of the connection to this, other than that Ripple was the creator of Interledger, and they continue to evolve the components within the Mojaloop project directly, since they have the most knowledge about it.
Yeah, and I think for those in the community, if you go to the Interledger website, they have a number of videos there that are very educational about like what the role of the protocol is and how it relates to the blockchain and other ledger systems. That's very educational, I found. So, and then one question related to the Interledger protocol connector that's come up from the community is just how difficult would it be to build out a connector for the Mifos backend? Have you had any providers yet work on that? Doing it for their DFSPs?
I can speak to that one.
We've got a lot of background noise. Somebody should be on mute. There's music and cafe noises.
Yeah, I think I got him, Brian. I think somehow he squeaked through as the one unmuted person.
Okay. So we are in lab environments with a number of some very similar providers of software. These are commercial core providers, and the amount of effort it took was a couple of weeks of part-time effort to get their back-end systems integrated. One of them, because of the structure of their system, is more like what yours seems to be. It was already well decomposed and supported the notion of real-time payments. That was very fast. The other one was more of a traditional core banking platform, and it required building some adapters into it that could simulate the real-time nature of the semantics, and then it was just a reuse of the code that's already out there to get it plugged into Mojaloop itself. So in each case, integrating the backend is not particularly complicated at all. Taking something live is more about figuring out who's going to participate in the scheme and what are the rules going to be, and then tailoring the end-to-end for that. That's where the hard part is, because people have to make decisions, and they're effectively used to working one way, and you're trying to get them to work another way. But as far as moving money, if you're already used to the notion of a real-time payment, then it's very straightforward. It's really just a API adaptation, and there's already code sitting there that you can use to plug that straight in.
Okay, great. And I think we've gotten a lot of questions from several different people on just current adoption and current usage of Mojaloop. Could you speak to any of that?
So we can talk a little bit about that. So we have some projects underway in East Africa and in West Africa, and also in Southern African development community. Those are not done, and they're not live, so we can't point to them. What we do have is establishing right now our lab environments. We have the GSMA is operating one. We will be setting one up for ourselves, and we have one that's going in for a consortium of mobile money providers that are looking to do something in Africa. And we have some others that are interested in pursuing this in Asia, such as in Myanmar and in Indonesia. Nothing at this point, though, is actually live where you could actually go and experience it directly. So we're going to have to rely on the lab environment for a while until some of these projects really get underway. Let's see, there were a couple of other questions too around the license. So all of the software is licensed under the Apache 2.0 license, which is a commercially permissive license. In essence, if I can paraphrase it quickly, you can take the software and do whatever you want with it. You're not required to contribute anything back. You're not really constrained on what you can do with it. We want your contributions very much, and that's one of the things that we'd like to do is see this community form to put Mojaloop into an environment where it can actually help us with the mission of interoperability between providers. So that includes the Mifos environment as well. So 2 Mifos implementations connecting through the Mojaloop system for switching purposes would be a quite interesting setup. And that's something that we think could be done fairly straightforwardly in a test environment.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add that we've also got some, so if we come back up to North American and regular traditional banking, we've got a lab environment set up with some credit unions in the United States who are able to push money through Mojaloop, and they're looking at it in a number of areas. One is just reducing the fees of moving money between their institutions, not terribly exciting. One is in the international remittance space. A lot of their customers come from the Philippines, South America, Mexico, and they send money home, and it's certainly got a compelling case there. And then the other, which is the nicest one, is they're using it to also broaden their thinking and kind of recognize that a credit union is supposed to be and has the ability to operate more for its members' benefit. And if you think about the people that they can't currently serve and start asking questions around why, is there a way for them to pick up the financial inclusion banner and really think about the products and services they might use and how you would structure them to kind of reach down that pyramid? And then what are the features of a payment platform or payment network that would support that? So they're making lots of good traction there as well, and that's I think going to be transformative, at least in the United States, over in the near future. So that's the only extra one I have.
So I would suggest also, there was a couple of questions on here about how do you integrate. If you had a DFSP, then you wanted to integrate into a Mojaloop system, where's the API for that? Is there a single place, an API documentation, or a kind of an SDK? The answer is no, there's no SDK. We're still at a basic phase 1 of this development work. So we have a sort of a completed set of functionality, and the documentation, as in most projects, is a bit lagging. However, there's documentation within the repositories themselves. Each one of the different 24 or so repos that make up Mojaloop have documentation about that particular area. There is also, though, something we haven't really talked much about today that we'll have to get to another time. We had commissioned a API specification to be developed by the 4 largest mobile money provider platforms. That is Ericsson, Huawei, Mahindra Conviva, and Telepin. They came together over the same period of time that we used to develop Mojaloop, and they developed an API for interoperability that specifies the semantic interoperability between platforms. We then, sometime during our effort, middle of last year, we converged the 2 programs. So what we see now is what we call the Open DFSP API for interoperability is, in fact, now what we would think of as the Mojaloop API. There is still some convergence work that has to go on to really pull that together tightly. But I think that would be a really good entry point to say, if I was a wallet platform and I needed to communicate interoperably in a market with others, that's the spec that we'd want to see used as the core conventions for that. And that Mojaloop is in harmony with that spec in a way that it can be used as the switching solution, the central service stack for directory, et cetera, to serve a community that uses that API. The link to that API, I don't know, Matt, maybe you could post that if we have it available, where they could find that doc and download it. I know it's a quite large doc, but it's actually pretty clearly written and really easy to enter.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Maybe, Ed, I can send that your way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after I'll send along the screencast of the webinar, and then any additional links and background material you would like to share for the benefit of the community, I'll pass those along as well. And then hopefully, if you're available to, we can share your contact information so people can follow up if they have direct questions. But I would encourage them to go, to the groups and communication forums as part of the open source Mojaloop community, And then for members of our community who've had questions about integration and test environments, so we at the Mifos initiative are working on trying to get some test environments set up and do some proof of concept integration. So hopefully we'll have good traction on that in the near future. And then if there's any partners or providers in the community that want to begin testing something out, we can assist with that. So.
And anybody who wants to continue and go on further with us, I would encourage you to go to mojaloop.io. That's the headwaters, if you will. And from there, there's a link to the Gitter community where we've been carrying on conversations around adoptions and some of these other questions. It might be a good place to take some of that. And then secondly, from there, you can find a link to the GitHub. All of those materials are open and freely available. We're in the process of establishing additional toolchain bits, and we may be moving to Slack, but none of that is actually firmed up yet. For now, it's Gitter for the conversations and GitHub for the issue list and roadmap, as well as the code.
Okay.
And anybody who has a question on email could send it to info@mojaloop.io.
Okay, we'll make sure all that gets passed on in the follow-up email. And then I know Safiso had one question about integration between the different payment gateways, and I know the routing happens through the central ledger and the interledger protocol, but for the actual integration with different payment systems, that would happen at the DFSP level, correct?
Yeah, the DFSPs themselves would adopt what we call the Mojaloop API, and that includes both parts where they communicate with each other for quotation, where they communicate with the Center for Central Directory Fraud and for clearing and settlement. And it's all done in a way that is harmonious and with a common set of data dictionaries and other elements to make the integration on the platform side easier. So I think that's something that we'll follow up with a link to that spec. I think it'll make things a little bit clearer. By the way, it's not necessary that you implement that spec in order to use Mojaloop. Mojaloop itself has at present an API that's built into it, but as we've said, we are converging on the DFSP, Open DFSP API as the common API for both projects.
Okay. Yeah, and I know we're at the end of the hour we had allotted, so I think we'll wrap up now, but this has been highly informative, and I think we had a good turnout from the community, and I look forward to continuing the discussion in the Mojaloop community, and hopefully we can make progress on getting members of our ecosystem, identifying use cases this could be implemented for, and we'll keep tracking the initiative and looking forward to see what happens in the lab environment that has been set up.
That would be great. We'd love to do that. Anybody interested in figuring out how to get Fineract and Mifos connected to a Mojaloop test environment, we'd love to talk to you.
Okay, yeah, we've got members of our team looking into that, but let's perhaps set up some, because I think we've identified a number of questions, and so we'll set up some specific time to hammer out those questions and get everything set up. So,
sounds great.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks everyone for hosting us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks everyone for the great questions, and we'll send along the recording and follow-up notes shortly. So, okay, take care.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Bye now.